When we play RPGs together, there often develops a thread of cause and effect. You might call it the main plot, according to some schools of gameplay and preference. But regardless, there's often a single locus that a session is built around, is building upon, building towards. Sometimes that thread is under such tension that it inevitably leads in a single direction. And when that same thread is struck, when events occur, it vibrates and twangs with beautiful sounds. There's many harmonics within that single thread. It can express multiple tones in that fashion. And yet sometimes that thread goes slack. Perhaps the string itself is cut by something like a total party kill, or just a long hiatus where the group doesn't get back together for a while, and when the humans sit back around the table together once again, they unfortunately are scratching their heads trying to piece together what last happened to the characters and what their goals were. It's in those times that I'm given to think that there's a lot to be said for having multiple threads. And that's what we're going to talk about today in our series called the 31 RPG Etudes, which is my own take on the RPG A Day Game Jam for 2020, which is an event where people in the community get together to vlog, blog, tweet, and create other forms of content about what enthuses them in the RPG hobby. Not about what they wish would be different in the RPG world, but instead what they love about it, or how they came to love RPGs. Over here in my CGA content ecosystem, of which this new channel is a part of it, we're giving some mind to taking RPG A Day in an interesting direction, a study course, a deep dive into different ideas in the RPG gameplay world. The idea is to create something which is a bit more evergreen, that viewers outside the month of August might find themselves pulled in by. I try to make content that I myself would spend the time to listen or watch. So let's get back to that idea of having multiple threads going at the same time. And what are the advantages? Well, for one, if the main thread goes slack, there's something that will pull on the characters, that will animate play. Or perhaps the characters, not knowing where to turn next with a main thread, still have something proactive that they can think about doing. At the same time, other plot threads, character dramas, quests for gear, or simple relationships with NPCs, or tracking down an accumulating list of clues about a mystery which is tangential to the primary objective, can be a means of communicating the passage of time. After all, there are so many different kinds of primary narratives which involve things which take a lot of time, or long journeys, or the narrative may even be about the drama of the characters' lives unfolding. Soap opera, if you will. And by the simple act of stepping away from the primary thread and spending physical IRL session time engaging with narrative twists and turns, plot points, if you want to call it that, within these side threads or perpendicular threads, we inevitably communicate that time is passing and that fruits are ripening on the primary thread. We're building up our anticipation for what happens next. Now, an important thing to note is that I think that in some places, the dominant idea within adventure design and even gameplay is the idea that that main thread, like I said at the beginning, inevitably leads in one direction. Well, I put to you that I really like the idea of a main thread which wends its way and goes around a corner. You may not know where it leads. It may even split and pull in two other different places, different directions. It's possible for the person sitting in the game master's chair to be right there with the players pulling on the thread and finding out where it leads. He doesn't necessarily have a spot at the end of that rope or even a few paces ahead of the player characters, kind of imagining where things go. You can all be discovering together. In fact, my favorite way to play RPGs is to step through the wardrobe together, a game master and players. We may not know where this thread is pulling us. Sometimes it may be the game master who has their hand on the slack in the lead and is pulling the other folks in the game forward. And in other cases, the players might be sprinting off in a new direction, holding the thread, and the game master is sprinting along behind them, trying to keep up. His imaginative equivalent of a cardiovascular system and his calf and hamstring muscles are building up the imaginative equivalent of a good physical condition. Where does this thread lead? None of us may know. We may all be taken for a ride by the intense believability and verisimilitude of the world that we're playing in, places like Harn. Or it could be that the narrative mechanics, things like the destiny pool in Star Wars Fantasy Flight, or the momentum and threat pools in 2die20, can end up shaping things in a fashion that none of us saw coming. And in traditional old-school Dungeons & Dragons, it could be the random encounter roll. It could be the random encounter roll that leads to the players meeting the Knights of the Realm, the young prince, Arthur, among them. In this way, for my part, the unfolding of the mechanics in play are another thread that I love to follow, and that often pulls things together into something satisfying. There's often a lot of folks who might be ready to talk about how the mechanics have worked against their intent, but to my mind, I don't mind being taken for a ride, because often the vista that ride takes me to is something completely unanticipated and often incredibly unique. One special sort of thread that I'd like to make note of, that I want to learn more about in RPGs, is the concept of the tripwire, which is described by Ron Edwards in his game, Circle of Hands. It's an explicit instruction from the game for the game master as he's preparing the adventure to note specific sort of events that the characters may trigger. Things like if the characters explore the abandoned keep, the ghost of the undead prince knows that the throne is occupied by a pretender. And this will shape the future for the characters who are knights in the service of the king forevermore. For me, playing out threads of this kind and the others I've described as a human being to experience that phenomenon of quantum coherence, it's a way for me to feel like I'm inside of the wave function, that sublime concept from quantum mechanics, in which, by dint of some miracle, a single electron can pass through two slits. So how have you used villains with an agenda, character backstory plots, and tripwires and their kin to enliven the experience of campaign play for your group? What are some ideas that are lurking in the back of your mind for future campaigns that will have multiple threads? I'm the Complex Games Apologist, and this is my other channel where I'm doing a little bit longer form and less prepared content that you might call podcasty. If you like this sort of thing, then I would encourage you to like and subscribe. I would tell you that you gotta get over to other folks who are participating in RPG a Day, give them some encouragement to see these 31 days out. And if you have the time after all that, to check out my main channel, where I have prepared content which is this thoughtful, but then I also managed to kind of tie up the loose ends and turn it into something even more useful and thought-provoking. I hope you're having a great August. I'm the Complex Games Apologist.